I'm
dressed in
a
a
lad who's grown up in Manchester, and then you go to Iran, and every Iranian woman in their handbag on a flight to Iran has a headscarf, because they know that as soon as they land on Iranian soil, they now have to start covering their hair, and it's not something that I ever was able to get my head around. We discussed this was to speak about the women's rights movement in Iran, which obviously means a lot to me, being a second generation immigrant of Iranian descent who used to travel back to Iran a lot as a kid. It's a subject that's very close to my heart. But yeah, no, let's ease into it. Let's talk about each other a little bit and why we're here, and see how it goes.
Okay. What are you worried about?
I've never done a podcast or a YouTube like this, so I will need words of affirmation from you every few minutes.
Yeah, you're gonna be fine. Wait, what are you envisaging for the podcast title?
Title?
Will it be like Women in Iran or something? Not women
in Iran, but I'm very conscious that I'm observing it from an outsider's perspective, with roots to the epicenter. So there is also guilt, because I'm living somewhere that's not going through this, although I am the same flesh and blood as those people who are suffering. So maybe the women's rights movement from a dual national's perspective.
Are you dual nationality?
Yeah.
You have a passport?
I have an Iranian passport, yeah.
Huh.
Which expired a few years ago. And I do have the option of going back to Iran to do my national service for 2 years in order to renew that passport. Do I want to go to Syria as an Iranian soldier? Rhetorical question.
Okay, let's start with how you grew up then.
Okay, so I'm from the north, although I have lived in London for 5 years, so the accent has worn off a little bit.
It sounds way softer than...
My father was 19 when he moved here from Iran, with very little. I managed to do very well for himself in a country that enables hardworking people to flourish, and he's instilled that hardworking mentality in me. Very lucky growing up as a kid in the UK. I would say, very privileged lifestyle, and something that came with that was every summer holiday we would go back to Iran for 5 or 6 weeks at a time, mostly because I have a huge extended family, aunties, uncles, grandparents, cousins, and you would spend the year looking forward to going back and seeing all your cousins. Iran in the summer, by the way, is a beautiful country. Everyone associates Iran with the hijab and a very conservative reserve country, but most houses have swimming pools out there. So for me, my definition of Iran was like any other summer holiday for a kid growing up, but just to deviate from the conversation of Iran. So I'm born and raised in Manchester, grew up in Cheshire, and that's where most of my mates are from. Majority of them have also moved down to London. I went to the University of Liverpool, studied law and international business for my masters, working in finance now in the city, and the older you get, the more I feel you do start to that there is this. So back to the context of Iran, I do feel like there is this overwhelming sense of guilt that most Iranian dual nationals, most, British-born Iranians would share this same guilt and empathy that I do, which is kind of why I want to speak about this, but also just to let the world know what's going on in Iran at the moment, the hardship that people are facing, and also just to get a few thoughts and ideas off my chest. So yeah, I think the more I'm speaking now, the more obvious it is. I want to talk about the women's rights movement. I want to talk about Iran's modern history and why we are here today, and what I think we should do to make things better for Iranians living in Iran.
So going back to when your dad came here, what year was that?
That was in the late 70s, early. So it was just before the revolution, actually, which I think was in 79. And my grandfather had told my father, look, there's nothing left for you here. Pretty sure there's going to be a revolution. And my grandfather worked for the Shah. He was an engineer, and he used to oversee one of the huge car factories for Mercedes, or one of the manufacturers out in Iran. And he knew some of the people who worked with the Shah, who were close to the Shah, and he had basically knew from others that there's Iran is no place for anyone who does not follow, does not practice Islam, because the Ayatollahs were getting more and more powerful, and everyone knew that a revolution was brewing, basically.
And your dad wasn't particularly religious?
No. So what you'll find is most Iranian expats, so Iranians living outside of Iran, are people who are the less religious demographic of Iran. So if you can imagine, any country becomes an Islamic republic, and overnight, women have to cover themselves. The people who emigrate, and the huge brain drain that came with that, a lot of them moved to Los Angeles. There's a famous district in Los Angeles called Tehrangeles. It's full of Iranian plastic surgeons. A lot of Iranians moved to London. I have relatives in Sweden. You'll find that most of us are not religious people. Nothing against Muslim Iranians, but that's just the way it panned out.
So would they have been Muslim at all, or another religion?
From my life experience, most Iranians who left Iran are either very, very moderate Muslims or not very religious.
But I mean, your dad.
My dad, and my mother as well, by the way. No, very moderate. My father doesn't practice Islam. My mother does, actually, but she'll still, she shows her hair. My mother's a beautiful woman, shows her hair, loves a glass of wine. So I'd say she's a moderate Muslim.
Shows her hair as in like wearing a loose hijab?
No, just doesn't have a hijab. Okay. Honestly, I'd say more than 90% of Iranians living outside Iran would not cover their hair with any.
But when she's back home, she has to wear it.
She has to wear a hijab back in Iran. But what's really interesting, and you might have noticed this, through social media and things that go viral, is that something which I think is remarkable and incredibly brave that's come out of the women's rights movement. So just for context, so Mahsa Amini was a Kurdish Persian lady who was visiting Tehran, I think just as a tourist, and Kurdistan, they're much more liberal with how they present themselves, and I think her hijab was down or half down, and she got taken in by the morality police, and I say morality police in inverted commas because there's not a lot that's moral about them, and they took Mahsa Amini to a prison and they beat her, and she eventually suffered from a heart attack and actually died in prison on the same day or the day after she got taken in, and the police denied involvement. She was comatose, actually, pardon my ignorance. She was comatose and she eventually died, unfortunately. And the morality police washed their hands of any responsibility. It was the straw that broke the camel's back, in the sense that we haven't seen these protests of this size in Iran since it was the same year that Michael Jackson died. So what was that, like 2000 and anyway, we hadn't seen it for over 10 years.
What were those other protests about?
There were huge protests happening in Iran that started to get traction with the media, and then Michael Jackson died and the whole press focused on that, and actually the whole world then,
was that around
their attention was turned away from those protests. And most Iranians will tell you that the most unfortunate thing about Michael Jackson dying was that it distracted the world media from those protests at the time. I want to say 2009 anyway.
And what were they about?
The same thing. So it was people going out onto the streets demanding secularism in Iran, basically. They don't want an Islamic republic. Can you imagine you're a woman, well-educated woman with access to the internet? Every time you leave your house, you have to cover your hair, which in the name of Islam is to promote modesty. And Iran is an Islamic republic, so by definition, most of its laws and values derive from the Quran, which I have nothing against. I just strongly oppose imposing those rules onto an entire nation. And what's really sad with Iran is this is the country that was the birth of, Rumi's poetry, or Shiraz wine. Shiraz was the capital of Persia, and the first Shiraz wine came from the city of Shiraz. It's why it's called Shiraz. And now the irony, the tragedy is Iranians are not legally allowed to drink Shiraz wine, whilst the rest of the world labels their wine Shiraz because of the way that it's made.
It's
women and men went out after the death of Mahsa Amini in anger and protested. And sorry, I digress, but what's really interesting with my mother, so you asked me the question, does my mother have to wear the hijab back in Iran? Yes, but they're doing it less so. So the fear has that barrier has sort of been broken. Now there are girls going out for the first time in a generation not wearing the hijab because they're less scared of the morality police and the authorities like they used to be. They're just angry now.
Got it. So yeah, I was just going to say Persia, longest running civilization.
Iran is technically the oldest country in the world.
Yeah. And okay, Michael Jackson died in June 2009. I was going to ask if it was to do with the Arab Spring, those protests, but that was 2010, I think.
Yeah, so I think this happened just before the Arab Spring. They weren't related.
So I was just going to say, because since I knew we were doing this podcast, I've just been listening to, I watched the documentary you sent me about the revolution, and then I've been listening to get my history up to scratch. Yep. So I think it's helpful to talk about it because a lot of people hear about Iran all the time in the media, like especially to do with nuclear weapons. But I feel like it's one of those things that people feel like they should know, but don't necessarily.
So was it The Queen and the Coup that you watched? It was on iPlayer. I think it's on Channel 4 now. It's called The Queen and the Coup.
Yeah, but that's not... I think what's interesting is like who the Shah was.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, it's classic. Like all this stuff is like post World War II. Everything's like moving around. And then it's like, okay, there's the Shah there who was...
Yeah.
So Iran was becoming more westernized. He was like supported by the US and the UK. There's like oil stuff going on, of course. But then he ended up being quite authoritarian, even though he was westernizing Iran. He was still this kind of ended up being kind of like a dictator by the end.
It does depend on who you speak to for their account of the Shah. So I come from a liberal family who are actually royalist. They really romanticize the Iran of the era of the Shah. And also remember that pulling a third world country out of poverty, there are always going to be those who are impoverished who will speak ill of whoever's in power. But Iran's economy in the 70s was 20 times the size of South Korea's, and it was one of the fastest growing countries in the world. And to go back to what you mentioned after World War II, so the UK, very little money, massive amounts of debt. There was the whole literally had to rebuild a country, and Churchill saw an opportunity in the Middle East with oil extraction. So the Anglo-Persian Company, who was very, very closely linked to the British government and also to the intelligence services. And this is all out in the public. This isn't like Fruit Loop conspiracy talk. This is watch The Queen and the Coup. If you're remotely interested in this, I urge you.
Okay, but it is like a very anti-British view, which is classic left-wing media.
So from my opinion, and I'll be really straight with you, my opinion of Britain's foreign policy in the Middle East is negative. I think that their impact in the Middle East through oil extraction has done more harm than it has good. Let me tell you a couple of things about the Anglo-Persian Company, which is now BP. So one of the reasons there was a fallout with the Iranian government, Mossadegh, in the 50s, he was a nationalist Iranian prime minister, was because Mossadegh demanded more revenues from the Anglo-Persian Company, which, and again, forgive me if I'm wrong, but I'm 99% sure that Iran was getting less than 15% to 10% of all oil revenues of Iranian oil. Most of it was leaving Iran and going to Britain. And all the executives of this joint venture, Anglo-Persian, were mostly British, and the ones who were Iranian were getting paid incredibly well. The diplomats and the executives were being paid off, not to become a problem. And Mossadegh simply demanded more revenue share to go to Iranians, so he could build a country. I think he wanted to fully nationalize it. This is according to this Channel 4 documentary that you sent me. But yeah, anyway, carry on. Which, by the way, if there was an Iranian oil company extracting oil in Britain, what do you think?
No, that's not how...
And the Iranian company in Britain wanted to fully nationalise those oil rigs on British soil. Do you think Rishi Sunak would let them?
Rishi Sunak would not be nationalising anything. All of the energy in this country, it's not owned by British. It's owned by like all different people. That's how business works. That's how globalisation works.
So you're telling me that there are foreign multinational corporations extracting oil in Britain?
In the North Sea, yeah, of course. They're not British companies. They're multinational oil companies.
Well then, I beg your pardon.
And they're owned by... I mean, that's just a difference of... Anyway.
I think it's very rare for a country that's impoverished to be okay with most of its natural resources being taken by a foreign actor. I think that's a reasonable assumption.
Anyway.
Yeah,
this is a whole different... Yeah. That's a political conversation. Fine. I'm interested in what you knew about Iran growing up. Like, what did your parents tell you? So it's like, long story, vague summary is, so Mossadegh, he was trying to nationalise it. Obviously, they want, Britain, still wants access to the oil, so does the US.
So Mossadegh was actually,
so they put the Shah in.
He was ousted by a coup orchestrated by MI6, and the exact same thing later happened to the Shah. So
so that was like 53, the coup d'etat, I think.
And then in 79, there were mercenaries who were paid by foreign actors. And so, for example, when the Shah was exiled, he was refused entry into the US, who had imposed him in the first place. So Iranians... Okay, so the point that I'm trying to make is when you
But
see...
wait. But then
Yeah.
just for the history for everyone. So then the Ayatollah who had been exiled to Paris, or he was in Paris for some reason. Why was that? Do you remember?
He was exiled in Paris and flown into Iran with an Air France aeroplane. So Iranians feel, and I know this because of the dozens of Iranians who I've spoken to about this, that the Ayatollahs were in the end enabled by Europe and the USA to complete the revolution, to go back to Iran and eventually, but it's complicated, but eventually sign those favourable oil deals with the West. But then that goes into opens a whole other can of worms, because then there were all kinds of things that happened afterwards with the hostage crisis in the embassies. So I don't want to get into all of that, but
that's the main thing that people will remember. Like when I asked my dad, can you give me like the 2-minute spiel on like what you know about Iran? And he was like, Dilly, your maths tutor was from Iran. You should ask him. I was like, I don't have time. Fuck up. And he's like, the hostage crisis is something that people who were alive during that time would remember, because and I was just listening to a podcast today. Oh my God, awful. Like some American guy it was like 444 days. He was like, and Jimmy Carter, they even said that's why Jimmy Carter, part of the reason he didn't win a second term potentially, because he was unable to rescue them. It's like,
it's honestly, Iran's modern history and its relationship with the USA is just really sad. Most Iranians, the reason that most Iranians do feel like they've had two, there's a lot of Iranians who are still alive who have seen two revolutions in their country, both orchestrated by the US. So now that this women's rights movement is happening, they're saying, hang on, you guys have helped out internal forces in Iran before. Why can't you help us now when the Iranian protesters want to open up the country in an economic sense? They want diplomatic relations with Israel, which is really important, by the way, because most Iranian pro-Ayatollah supporters, they're the ones burning the American flags. They're the ones saying death to Israel. They're the ones who want to wipe Israel off the map. Ordinary Iranian people, you have to remember, Israel, the Middle East had its largest population of Jews actually in Iran before Israel. My dad used to live in areas where all his friends and neighbours were Jewish, and that's unimaginable now because so many of them were ousted during the Islamic Revolution, and quite rightly so, or executed.
Wait, quite rightly so?
No, quite rightly so. They left. What Jewish person in their right mind would want to live in an Islamic republic? Because that would be hell on earth for them.
Yeah.
And sadly, they had to leave. And this is one of the really important points of the women's rights movement, that, this sanctioned Iran that is hostile to the rest of the world. The women's rights movement wants to reverse all of that.
Okay, wait, why? What's the US got to do with the revolution with the Ayatollah?
Most Iranians...
Oh, you're saying because he flew on an Air France flight, somehow
he was flown in
the West was
on an
supporting
Air France,
him.
chartered Air France flight, and he was exiled in France.
When was he originally exiled?
He was a terrorist who had... he was allowed to stay in France during the whole boiling up of the revolution, and then they flew him in, and then the Shah, who turned to the West for help, was denied entry into the West. I think he died in Egypt. The Channel 4 thing says he died in Egypt, but then I was listening to this other podcast that he said he was waiting heart surgery in the US or something. No, he wasn't allowed entry into the US.
Huh.
This is a man who was literally imposed he was brought in by the CIA to take over Mossadegh, and got too big.
He wasn't brought in, he was already the Shah. He was the son of the Shah who they got rid of, like his dad, then the British got rid of.
Yeah, and then the monarchy was reintroduced with the help of the CIA.
But I mean, they didn't like invent him
as soon as he had a very famous interview, the Shah, where he said he didn't want the. He said something about the blue-eyed American telling him what he can and cannot do, and most people perceive that to be his downfall, because he basically got too big for his own boots. And going back to what we were saying before about, you know, wanting more favourable oil deals and whatnot, I just don't think he was from a commercial point of view. I just don't think the West could do business with him anymore.
But so your family were generally happy living under the Shah, because I guess they were in with him, or
my family with him. And all Iranians who I speak to really romanticize the Iran before the Islamic Republic. So students would get massive bursaries if they wanted to go and study abroad. They'd literally get paid by the government to go and spend a few years in another country, bring back the knowledge. And that's a very historic thing. That's happened for thousands of years in Persia, where people would go to France and Italy and learn about the arts and bring it back to Iran, and that would influence architecture and food and culture, and that's something that the Shah always promoted. Nowadays, you look at the case of Iran and, you know, refugees trying to escape by boats. It's just another world to what I get told Iran was like pre-revolution.
But have you heard this stuff about him being quite authoritarian, and how there was like the left-wing uprising against him as well?
It's really interesting because the Shah's son, who is now trying to he's the sort of main figurehead for the women's rights movement, and a lot of Iranians want him to be a temporary leader whilst they reintroduce a secular, fully functional democracy. The Shah's son is actually very critical of his father, and I think brutality that might have gone on, huge displays of wealth when the country still had a lot of people in poverty, completely tone deaf. A perfect example is he threw, it was considered the most lavish party of the century. He invited every leader and royal family and diplomat to Tehran, and they built this, what was effectively a town, to house these people for a couple of weeks, and they would have literally in their like cabins like gold furniture and caviar, and this was at the same time that Iran had huge social issues with a wealth gap, and poverty existed pre-revolution as well. And I think these were things that contributed to his downfall, because actually when there was an Islamic revolution, it was the largest protest by population of its kind for I think a generation in the world. There were tens of millions of Iranians out on the street protesting. Looking back, those tens of millions of Iranians, they were promised free education, free healthcare, free energy, cheap food, massive subsidies. They were basically offered a socialist sort of haven.
By who?
By the Ayatollahs.
Yeah, because it was like...
They were promised the world.
Yeah.
And it was actually very left-wing.
This is what I was listening to. These people who had left, who were then coming back. These like left-wing Iranian women who were coming back, and they were so excited about the revolution. Because I guess they thought these left-wing ideals would come through. And then it was like suddenly this like ultra-religious conservative, and having to, not being able to wear makeup, having to wear the hijab. Yeah. This woman's explaining like her friend being literally executed. Like one of her friends. A lot
of the Shah's diplomats, so like, for example, like the Minister of Culture, for example, a lot of them just got executed. And Raisi, who is the current Prime Minister of Iran, he allegedly has signed off a lot of those killings. A lot of amnesty groups, human rights groups, they still today advocate not, why would you even speak to someone who has committed these heinous acts in the past? And that's what a lot of people in Iran envisage their government as, that, they have a lot of blood on their hands. They killed thousands of people during these protests. I spoke to my cousin on the phone a few weeks ago and said, why have the protests seemed to have died down? And he said, Daniel, like, our parents won't let us go out, because every time we go out, you hear stories of people being taken into prisons. The schoolgirls being poisoned today in schools. They're contaminating their water.
Who is?
Supposedly the Iranian government. It's that they have very brutal crackdowns, and always have under the Ayatollahs, where they will just kill the protesters in order to... sorry, I didn't know this conversation would get so heavy. They will kill protesters to deter others from coming out. And before, when I mentioned that barrier of fear has been broken through, it takes courage for a woman to leave her house in Iran without a hijab. Look what happened to Mahsa Amini. And now you see videos coming out of Instagram, Facebook, of these shopping malls in Iran where dozens of girls, in their droves, are just displaying their hair as if they're in a European country. And it is so inspiring. It's so brave what we're seeing today, in my opinion. And, good on them.
Okay. Sorry, I know we're jumping all over the place, but just going back to... So, 1979, the revolution happens. Interestingly, not that many... Sorry, it's like around 2,000 to 3,000 people die coming up to the revolution. This is like all these stats, because coming off these podcasts. But then more people, because usually a lot of people are dying like in a revolution, but in this case, the amount of people who die in the revolution is actually far less than the amount of people who die in the following years. So like in the 80s, this period we're talking about where they think there's going to be left-wing like great times, and they got rid of the Shah, who's wants to live like royalty, and while there are people in poverty. Yeah. And then because that people are being executed, basically. So it's like thousands of people dying. And then there's also Iraq invades Iran at that time. Which a lot of people don't know about. There's a war that goes for 8 years. But basically from then till today, we have these extremely... How would you describe it? Extremely... It's an Islamic state run by an Ayatollah. It's the same... Khomeini? It's the same
Khomeini.
guy?
It's confusing because the first Ayatollah was Khomeini and the second one is Khamenei. So it's very confusing, but well pronounced, and also very.
It didn't sound anything like
it was good. It was good enough. You're Australian. You're not supposed to even be able to say kh.
Oh, that's how you say it.
The Iraq-Iran war is a really, really interesting point because, first of all, over 1 million people died in that war. It was incredibly
Apparently
deadly.
not. Sorry,
come on.
This podcast says apparently sorry, I must have found this super niche podcast.
I am also being educated tonight.
So apparently that was a propaganda figure that they used to the Ayatollahs used to say, look how much people have suffered. Are you Googling it now?
Yeah, no.
And
I'm not saying
this
I'm not saying right or wrong. I just want to know, out of curiosity.
Okay, so the podcast I was listening to was saying that was like a propaganda figure, and actually in the numbers of people who died, the actual number is like 200,000, and tons of casualties. So total, including casualties, might have been towards that. But he was saying that figure was passed around because obviously 200,000 people is a lot of people, and like every life lost is tragic. But he was saying that they inflated the numbers to enforce those rules of like, look how much these people have suffered for you, therefore you need to be a good like Muslim person and wear your hijab.
Yeah, it's all about, I mean, come on, like, arguably a lot of, and I might get in trouble for this, and I should disclose now that I'm not a religious person, I don't follow any religion, but I think a lot of religion is instilled on fear. You look at art in Europe, it's, you go into churches, it's God-fearing, and I think the Ayatollahs are using a very similar strategy with its people. Interestingly, so the Encyclopedia Britannica says it was 1 million. Wikipedia, which is famously unreliable, says 500,000. Let's just go with an incredibly
I can send you this podcast.
high number of people died,
people
which is
died.
obviously incredibly tragic. What happened at the time was Iraq saw weakness in Iran. It was a fairly unstable new government. There were all kinds of factions growing within these different political parties, and as you said, there was this rise of the left-wing parties that going on at the same time. And Iraq, Saddam Hussein saw an opportunity, and it was a perfect example of how Iran is actually very nationalist, regardless of who's running its country, because millions of people went and fought and stopped Iran from being invaded by Iraq, which I am told was the aggressor in the war. Saddam Hussein literally invaded Iranian territory. And going back to...
Wait, sorry, is that a Sunni Shiite thing? Because Iran is Shiite.
Yeah, exactly. I think
and Saddam Hussein was Sunni.
I actually don't know. I think Iraq is split between Shia and Sunni, but I'm not.
I just googled if Saddam Hussein is Sunni, and he
which, is he Sunni?
Yeah.
So I don't want to make sweeping statements and start offending people who know much more about it than I do.
Who are you worried about offending?
Iraqi Shiites.
I don't know how many Iraqi Shiites listen to this podcast. Actually, I can see
you can never be too careful these days.
But if they do, they can come on and then educate us. We're just trying to learn.
Because I'm sure an Iraqi person sitting here might have a completely different account to me, and I would like to hear it. Maybe an Iraqi person sat here will tell me that actually Iran were aggravating them. Maybe they backed Iraq into a corner. I don't know. It's always good to have a balanced conversation with different opinions.
Okay, so your extended family were all in Iran during this time. It was just your dad.
My extended family were in Iran at the time, and also just going back to the and this is what I would call a slight chip on my shoulder, is the American government actually funded Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq war. You can look that up. This is common knowledge, okay? And Saddam Hussein...
The only people coming after you after this podcast are Americans.
I'm fine with. This is a hill I'm willing to die on, because Saddam Hussein used mustard gas in that war. There was chemical warfare, and America funded Iraq. So this... I just think Iran has had it's been dealt such a bad hand when you look at Western intervention in that region. Going back to this women's rights protest, I just think there are certain things, this is a really interesting point I want to make, that the West could do to really help Iranians, ordinary Iranians. For example, the Ayatollahs there's thousands of them, and they have thousands of kids, grandchildren, educated at the best schools in Europe and the US, and they're living Western lives whilst Iranians are being forced to wear a hijab. Something that the American and the British government could do is sanction them. Send their children back to Iran, and as soon as you start interfering with those families and their day-to-day lives, they might listen, they might come to the table. As soon as an Ayatollah, 5 kids get sent back from boarding school in Switzerland back to Tehran, and, they've been enjoying these Western lifestyles, which they do, by the way. They always get outed on Instagram, a lot of them. whose dads are literally like sending women to jail for years for showing their hair, whilst their sons and daughters are having lavish lifestyles in London. Over here, by the way, there's a lot of them in South Kensington, in Mayfair. Why can't we inconvenience the Ayatollahs in the same way that they inconvenience? And I don't mean an eye for an eye inconvenience. Oh my God, I don't want to throw their kids in jail. But let's impose some sanctions. Let's say, okay, well, you know, if you're imposing these rules on your people at home, why should your kids be enjoying these lavish lifestyles in Europe? It's just a thought. A lot of Iranians have been speaking about this recently. They think it's really rubbing salt in the wounds of oppressed Iranians at home when these, effectively these oligarchs who actually run most of the pillar industries in Iran, if you look at telecommunications, steel, oil and gas, a lot of these companies that are, by the way, state-owned, the ownership tends to stem down to these Ayatollahs who are imposing these archaic laws on Iranians whilst enjoying the fruits of Iran themselves. And it makes me angry. And this is the reason that I'm here to talk about it. I just want to say, by the way, here's what's going on. I'm probably never going to be allowed to go back to Iran again. I was photographed at a protest in Trafalgar Square. We know, Iranian protesters, that there are photographers operating all over Europe and the US. They were in Berlin. They've been photographed in Washington. They've been photographed in London. And what they do is they send these pictures back to the Iranian embassies, back to the Iranian governments, who are now imposing really, really sophisticated facial recognition technology by China, by the way, who's providing this technology to the Iranian government to clamp down on. So the next time I go to an airport in Tehran and I'm trying to get in, they say, hang on, here you are at this protest in Trafalgar Square, we're not letting you in.
And why is China providing this to Iran?
China is... When Iran can't trade with the West, it looks east. China isn't really honouring the American-imposed sanctions on Iran. And Iran are doing lots of trade with China. They've just signed a 25-year deal they get discounted oil and gas from Iran. And that's not the only natural resource, like fruit, milk, all the livestock in Iran. They're doing a lot of trade together, and something that Iran get in return from China is this facial recognition technology that you get in cameras being erected on every street in Tehran, all the major cities. And something that this facial recognition technology is doing is helping the Iranian government clamp down on the protesters. So China are illicit in this, and the women's rights movement is being harmed by this technology.
This whole episode needs to be fact checked, but that's
please do.
It's very very interesting what is going on with, because have you heard this other thing about how China, this is a whole nother thing, but how China basically fund left-wing professors or professors who are going to different things that are basically make us turn against each other in the West. Mm-hmm. It's like the whole same thing with Russia, like back in when the Soviets were doing it to cause disruption. It's like the
election scandals with Russia's involvement.
So the idea is if we hate ourselves so much and we're spending the whole time arguing about how bad, which is why I'm looking at that documentary being this is probably funded by China to make us be oh, we're so bad, we're evil in Britain and whatever other white countries.
Look, let's not try and be really black and white, good versus bad, because I don't think it ever is a case of good versus bad. I think the world is more complicated.
No, I never said good versus bad. This is an anti-good bad podcast. Yeah, but it's all just nuance.
Yeah, exactly.
But
I agree.
anyway, basically I'm saying people have been telling me this and talking about how, AI, there's 15 million people working in the Ministry of Propaganda. Like, I'm really scared to talk about this because I want to go to China one day. I don't want to be I don't want to be cancelled by that. Maybe I have to go one day soon. But I'm wondering if what you're saying is true, whether that's part of like using technology to like weaken the West in a way, like by strengthening, because that's like an anti-Western measure, basically, is what you're saying. Because if they're like stopping people who are protesting for Western values, i.e. freedom, from coming in.
Yeah.
And you have friends who that literally happened to.
Friends that what happened to, sorry?
That they use the photo ID thing.
Yeah, I've had a very close family friend who I'm not going to name was denied entry to Iran because she was seen protesting. She actually got sent home, which is by their standards quite lenient. That they didn't just throw her in prison. And Iran's strongest bargaining chip from a diplomatic perspective is political prisoners. And
how does she know it was because it was from a photo from the protest?
They told her. They said, we have pictures of you protesting.
Really?
Yeah.
At the border?
Yeah.
So it's literally like scan the passport.
Yeah.
And it.
Yeah. No, this is happening.
Like an indication.
This is happening today, and it's not just pictures. It's informants. They'll snoop on your social media. So they'll take you in a room for 10 minutes. You've not been to Iran for 10 years. What are you doing here? And then they'll ask you to get your social media up in front of them. They'll ask you to get your camera roll up in front of them. They'll ask you to open your Twitter.
That's happened to people, you know.
Yeah. Iran. Okay, so please help me by recognizing Iran as a very brutal regime that is fighting for survival. And what happens with an animal when it's backed into a corner fighting for survival is it becomes vicious. They are scared. They've never seen protests like this since the Islamic Revolution, and their only way to stop this is by cracking down with an iron fist. And you can fact check this later, please. Russia and China, who are Iran's closest allies, have been helping the Ayatollahs to clamp down on these protests. Russia have been helping from a strategic perspective. They've been sending consultants, informants. Here's how you stop them. Basically, you can fact check this, please. And I would like, if I'm wrong on something, please tell me. But this is stuff that I'm reading, and I'm watching liberal, so privately owned Iranian news channels, or like Washington Post, CNN have been very good with the women's rights movement. They've been posting very actively. And from my cousins in Iran, these are the stuff that they're all telling me is going
on. Yeah. So
is this the direction that you wanted this to go in, by the way?
We're still on the growing up bit. Like, okay. I'm still trying to... I still haven't asked you about being a Liverpool supporter and playing with the...
So let's
Liverpool
really quickly, just tying this back to growing up. There is an overwhelming sense of guilt with all of this happening because, my cousins in Iran who, they see my life on Instagram. They're not allowed to go to parties, or, they're not allowed to go to the beach unless they're wearing a hijab. And I feel responsible with free speech, like we're doing here, exercising free speech, to talk about this stuff with people who are interested in politics, who have a podcast, and I want people to know what's going on in Iran. And I know that some of the stuff I've said is very extreme, but it is happening. And those people, they just don't have anyone of influence helping them at the moment. The Ayatollahs have China and Russia. What did the women's rights movement have? Nothing. And
they couldn't... how hard is it to leave at this point? I mean, not saying
a lot of
they should
Iranians
just have
do
to leave their home.
try to leave, and a lot of the refugees that you hear of coming by boat via Calais to the UK, a lot of them are actually Iranian.
But if your cousins wanted to move to the UK, like your dad did back in the day,
there are some routes. I know that a lot of Iranians move into Canada. I think it's expensive as well. Visa applications and sponsorships, and not every Iranian has that privilege. But I don't think the solution is...
obviously the whole millions of people can't leave. I'm just wondering about, like, if you have, you know, your family, is it that they would... Because, so when your dad came over, the rest of his family stayed, or did anyone else come over?
So actually, by choice, most of his family stayed just because they already have kids in schools. They just get on with it. You know, they crack on with the Islamic Revolution, and they just wear So my aunties they're just so used to it now. They'll just wear a headscarf when they leave the house. And, you know, that's because that's what they're told to do. And a lot of them love Iran. Like, don't get me wrong. I'd like to think I'm a pretty well-traveled person. Iran is genuinely one of the most beautiful places I've ever been to. It is so lush and rich in, there's beaches, there's forests, there's jungles, there's mountains.
Ski there, right?
You can ski there in like a 40-minute drive from Tehran, in the middle of, a massive city, 40 minutes away from the ski slopes. It's amazing. So a lot of Iranians just don't want to leave. Also, have you ever tried Iranian food? Why would you want to leave the country?
Okay, but your dad wanted to leave.
Yeah, so he did have other ideas.
My hairdresser's from Iran as well.
Really?
He wanted to leave because, I guess, people who want to run their own businesses.
Well, it's like any country has a certain demographic who emigrate, just like anywhere else. But there was a particularly strong brain drain in Iran after the revolution, because every non-religious, every professor, engineer, doctor, or people who openly supported the Shah decided, in the similar way that the huge Jewish community did, this is no longer a place for me. And there was a brain drain. A lot of them now work at, all the big firms in America. There's a lot of doctors. NASA took not too dissimilar to the Nazis when Germany were taken over. A lot of Nazis ended up working for NASA. Google it.
Oh yeah, I have heard that.
But I'm not associating Iranian royalists with NASA. Sorry.
Okay. So, and what about your mum's family?
Mum's family are actually a little bit more religious than my dad's family.
When did she leave Iran?
She left Iran at 19 when my father went back and met her and proposed to her. So she left well into the Islamic Republic. I think it was... My dad's about 10 years older than my mum, so she went early 80s straight to England, not motivated by anything but love.
And was she happy to leave?
Yeah, she was. She enjoys... Imagine leaving a country that you have been oppressed for your whole life. I think girls have to wear a headscarf from the age of like 8 in Iran to, landing in the UK, and, straight away you have freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom to wear whatever you want. It must feel amazing, especially as a woman.
But
it
could be scary for a lot of people.
Maybe if you are a deeply religious person, in my opinion, you want to wear a hijab, you want to be modest, you don't want to touch alcohol. My mother's quite she's a liberal, very modest Muslim person, and she loves it. She loved it here. She used to go... I remember when I was a kid, she used to go to like pop concerts, and she'd come home and she'd, go out to pubs and bars with, my father, her friends, and these are just luxuries that Iranians just don't have.
But she still spends a fair bit of time back in Iran.
She goes back frequently just because she's got a huge extended family there, brothers and sisters. She still loves Iran.
So she just adapts to the...
She adapts, and she enjoys the best of both worlds, I guess.
And so what did they tell you about Iran's history growing up? Or what did they tell you about the government?
My mum's side of the family.
Or just both in general? Or just,
honestly, very, very idealised, romanticised view of what Iran used to be like, and still is, by the way. There's a lot of things about Iran that survived the Islamic Revolution. So the food, for example, is still phenomenal. The hospitality of Iranians, I always hear from people who tell me that they've been to Iran, like backpackers, is that Iranians don't ask for money after they just want to feed them. They're just very, very hospitable, warm people. Maybe it's because they haven't had mass tourism in, the same way that maybe like Morocco or Tunisia or Turkey has. So Iranians are actually quite flattered and excited when they see tourists, and they want to make it their business to make sure that they go back and speak fondly of Iran. I think there's an element of that as to why Iranians are so nice to tourists.
But I mean, what did they tell you about the current government?
The current government? Oh, people speak about the current government as you would expect them to. This is a government that anyone who is vocal against them is thrown in jail. Anyone who goes out and protests is at the risk of being shot dead on the street. What do you think they say about the government? It's not even. So one last thing I'll say about this before we move on to the next question. Even devout Muslims in Iran, in their millions, have had enough of the Ayatollahs. It's un-Islamic to be killing the amount of people that they have been killing.
Do you know anyone who supports the Ayatollahs?
On my life, literally not a single Iranian anymore.
But at one point?
I think when I was very young in Iran, and, a family friend who is very religious would wear a full hijab. We're talking more than 15 years ago now. Maybe at one point one of them would say something nice about the Ayatollah. Literally no one in my current life. I know so many Iranians through work, through playing football, through social media, through friends and family. Literally no one supports the Ayatollahs anymore.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. Sorry to the audience that this podcast has gone all over the place, but I guess when you're talking about something sensitive with a lot of emotion, that can happen. But I apologise to the Ayatollah supporters who I've said this to, and please do reach out to me if you are British-born Iranian who supports the Ayatollahs, because I'm not sure that would exist.
Yeah, I don't think they exist.
And I don't think... No. I'm just saying, sorry, because I just want to understand about... I started asking you about him. Khamenei or Khamenei.
Yep, go on. Try again.
I don't want to get
you
killed by him
you
for
did the hard bit.
His name. Khamenei.
Yes.
He's been in power for 33 years, but he's really old.
When Khomeini died, I don't know how many years ago it was. I think Khomeini died late 80s. I think Khamenei was the next supreme leader,
and he's been for 33 years.
Yeah,
and so he's a supreme leader, but you say there are thousands of ayatollahs, which just means it's higher than an imam.
Yeah, they're all. So the way it works in Iran is you have the religious establishment, with the supreme leaders at the top, and you have the morality police. I've read in a politics class from years ago that it's purposefully complicated as well, so that if one group, for example, if the morality police rebels or tries to orchestrate a coup, there's 5 or 6 other factions that they would have to convince as well. One of those is the members of parliament. So Iran has supreme leaders and Muslim clerics who are the voice of God, in a sense, similar to, you know, kings and queens of the past in Europe. And then you have democratically elected members of parliament in Iran. So we have the Prime Minister, Raisi, who is voted in democratically. I say democratically with a pinch of salt because every MP is essentially vetted and approved by the Ayatollahs. And so, for example, you could never get an atheist into parliament in Iran. It just is unheard of. It would never happen. And then the pendulum is actually the spectrum is quite narrow. So you had the Green Movement, the Green Party, which was in 2009. They're all religious people on, you know, left or right, or whichever way you want to look at it. And anything that they say or do ultimately gets signed off by the Ayatollahs. So it's a charade, in my opinion. It's a sham democracy, and this is what Iranians are protesting to change. They want. When I say Iranians, I'm going to be really, really honest here. It's not every single Iranian. There are still, in a country with, I think, 70 million people, there are still millions of people in Iran who support the Ayatollahs. I haven't met one for at least 15 years. Anyone who you speak to, from my perspective, in Iran, is demanding change, and you're seeing it now on the streets. But most people in Iran, I would say, are urging or are protesting for a complete overhaul in the establishment, and they just want a secular democracy.
And for you going back there, when's the last time you visited?
I went back in 2015 for about 2 or 3 weeks when I graduated from university. So
on that trip, or on earlier trips, what is it, because you're talking a lot about how oppressive it is for women, but is there anything for you that you have to do differently than being in the West?
Yes. So, and this is a really interesting point. So there is a huge underground subculture in Iran. So, you know, in every apartment block, there will be, you know, secret house parties that go on in the same way that you would acquire, you know, illegal drugs in the UK is the exact same way they would get booze in Iran, for example. So you do have teenagers, or you do have younger people, or people of all ages. It's just bootlegged. You do have, you know, discos, parties that out in the countryside. A lot of them get closed down, but you know, they do still try to express themselves and blow off steam in the same way that we do, but it's just done very, very discreetly.
Would your family ever have alcohol?
Yeah. So you go into an apartment in Iran, and you know, it's in a cupboard in case you get fucking raided by the morality police.
Where do they get it from?
It get in the same way that someone might get, you know, weed in London.
What, someone whispers to you on the street?
No, just, you know, everyone has a number. You know, everyone knows a guy. It's bootlegged.
So it's like moonshine or something.
Yeah.
It's like homemade.
They bring it in from Turkey. They bring it in from the United Arab Emirates, across the Persian Gulf. There's always a way. And then something else as well is because the opium route from Afghanistan to Europe, it goes straight through Iran. So actually, there's a really bad opium crisis in Iran because these young people have got very easy access to hard drugs, and that's something that the kids are dealing with at the moment. They have really high heroin addiction in Iran because it's quite cheap as well, because it comes from Afghanistan, Afghan farmers through Iran, and then the prices go up when it gets into Europe to the organised crime recipients. But so yeah, that's also an issue, the opium crisis in Iran.
Okay, you totally didn't answer my question.
What did you
ask? That for you on holiday in Iran,
yeah,
if there's anything that you feel like, other than, okay, you can't drink alcohol, but is there any, like, you obviously, if it was me going, although would I have to wear a headscarf, or women, like,
you would have to wear a headscarf,
Westerners as well? Okay, yeah. So it's like for women, like, is there anything you have to do, like, you don't have to do anything majorly different?
Honestly, Iran is a man's world. Men can leave the house wearing a shorts and a t-shirt. The courts even favour men overwhelmingly against women with divorces, for example. The laws, in my opinion, are very much written by the men in Iran. A really good example of this is that there's a very famous Iranian female judge during the reign of the Shah who literally came to work after the revolution when the Ayatollahs became the supreme leaders, and she arrived at the courts. I really wish I remembered her name because this is a true story. And they said, "What do you think you're doing?" And she said, I'm trying to get to work. She said, "No, you're a woman. We don't have women judges at this level. If you want to stay here, you can become a cleaner." So I think...
And what happened?
That was a very extreme example of a very early Iranian government. I think it's less rigged now towards women. Although from what I hear from my Iranian cousins, female cousins who are in Iran, they think it's a man's world in Iran, basically.
Shirin Adi.
True story.
Is
Told you.
Wait, no, that's someone who... Okay, I don't know if that's her. She won a Nobel Prize.
I actually don't know.
Okay. Who knows if anything we're saying on this podcast? No, just kidding. No, okay, wait, you still didn't answer my question. So there's nothing you have to do besides not drink alcohol? You don't really have to change your behaviour at all? Or you're just more careful about not saying things like the stuff you're saying on this podcast?
So I'm just trying to remember. Like, I'm trying to remember when I was back in Iran, what did I find?
Or was the first time you went, was it like massive culture shock? Or not really?
So you would have... So for example, I'd get told off for taking pictures in certain parts of the city. If I was near like a government building, or somewhere where civil servants work, you have to be careful of where you take photographs because they don't want these photographs circulating in England, for example. Don't ask me why. So you just always sort of tiptoeing on eggshells with that. I always used to go in the summer, and something that really, really stood out to me is that, if I leave the flat with my mum and it's like 40 degrees, she would have to wear what's called a palto. So it's like a long overcoat so that you're not showing any skin. Basically, you have to cover your entire body. And she would have to wear a headscarf. And I would be allowed to be wearing shorts and t-shirt. And the only reason for that is because I'm a bloke and because she's a woman. So the guilt is not just when you're in England, it's when you're in Iran as well, as a guy, in the sweltering heat. This is how women have to live their day-to-day lives. That's something that stands out to me.
And do you remember being like, "Mum, why are you dressed like that.
Yeah, and she just get on with it, because it's all you know. She literally grew up there from a kid, and you get told to do one thing your whole life, and you become conditioned to do that. And this is why these protests are very, very remarkable, because these girls who are out on the streets have never been able to express themselves in ways that they're now starting to exercise.
But do you remember being shocked by that?
Of course, because
by seeing your mum
I'm
dressed in
a lad who's grown up in Manchester, and then you go to Iran, and every Iranian woman in their handbag on a flight to Iran has a headscarf, because they know that as soon as they land on Iranian soil, they now have to start covering their hair, and it's not something that I ever was able to get my head around. I just couldn't. So the whole argument is modesty. Women should, only their husband should be able to see them in, with their hair down and in public. They should. I couldn't get my head around it. It's a moral. It's a message that I could never understand from a moral perspective. But that's because I'm born here, and pardon my ignorance, but it's not something that I could ever understand. And even to this day, put it this way: it's a rule that was definitely written by a bloke and not a woman. I think it's misogynistic. I think it's a way for and this has nothing to do with Islam, by the way, because I have Muslim relatives who do not practice this. It's really important to distinguish this, because there are Islamic countries where they don't impose the hijab. But I think these kind of rules are a man's way for a woman to become their property. And I know that's a controversial thing to say. I might get in trouble for it, but I really do. I just can't imagine a woman sitting down and writing that law onto paper.
And what do you think about women who choose to wear the hijab?
Good on them. I believe in choice. If you want to wear a hijab, please wear one. If it makes you feel like, you're promoting your modesty, or for whatever reason, please wear one. It's the forcing the rules onto other people who might not be remotely interested in expressing themselves in that way. That's the part that I can't get my head around, and that's why I always was always quite fearful of the Iranian government. And you see the police out on the streets, but they literally patrol, the morality police. There are people whose job it is to patrol the streets of Iran, making sure that women are covering their hair. It's dystopian.
So would you have planned to go back anytime soon?
I'd love to go back, just because I've got so many relatives there. I've got a huge emotional connection to Iran. It's my roots. It's my heritage, and culturally, Iran for thousands of years was flourishing. It was doing just fine. Cyrus the Great wrote the constitution that the American Constitution is based off. Iran has a hugely rich culture of arts, of music, poetry, liberal thinkers, great minds whose ancestors, whose relatives are still living there today. And you have these incredibly inspiring, intelligent people who I go back and I talk to, and they're not all conservative people, and that's what I miss about Iran. I miss the food, the people, the scenery, and it's a shame because the Iranian government doesn't recognize dual nationality, so it's not like I can just go there with my British passport. They see me as an Iranian who owes 2 years of national service to the country. I could go to an embassy in Iran and get a stamp and pay them off because it's a deeply corrupt country. I could go and pay a few £1,000s and get an exemption. But a part of me thinks, fuck you. I don't want to bribe the Ayatollahs to go back to Iran. I also have to be really careful because, I mean, even this podcast, even, you know, being photographed at the protest, being vocal on my Instagram, you know, got like, you know, over 1,000 followers, and people talk, people send this stuff back to people who you don't want knowing, and you know, why would I go back to Iran just to become a fucking political prisoner? It's happened to so many people. It's not worth the risk. I'll go and meet my relatives in Dubai or Turkey. But one day, you know, if the women's rights movement progresses, if, you know, if something happens, if we see real change, I'd love to go back to Iran as much as I can and encourage Westerners to go back, because there's a lot of great stuff going on there.
Yeah, I would love to visit there. So are you going to feel good about sharing this podcast with your followers?
Because I feel like it's just been verbal diarrhea. There's a lot that I've wanted to get off my chest for months now with the protest. I don't know if what I've been saying has been eloquent or, you know, at the best of times. I just hope people understand that this is coming from a good place. I want to tell people the truth about what I'm hearing from, you know, feet on the ground in Tehran, people who are going out to these protests, literally reporting back to me. And I want people to know that Iran's history has been blighted in, you know, on some occasions by Western intervention, and I think, you know, America and the UK maybe owes this to Iran. Cut them some slack. Help the protesters in any way that you can. In the same way that Ukraine is getting help from the British Army. That ultimately, I think that would be a huge step in the right direction for democracy. You know, if anyone that holds any decent moral values is, let's get more people on board with the idea that these women's rights protesters have every right to be backed by us, you know, in the West. And that's honestly what I think from the bottom of my heart. And saying that will probably get me banned from going back to the Islamic Republic of Iran forever until something changes. But that's how I feel from the bottom of my heart.
Is there anything else you want to say?
I want to apologise if I've offended anyone for anything that I've said. I have many, many Muslim relatives who I love and respect dearly who also oppose the Ayatollahs. I don't want to associate anything derogatory that I've been saying about the Ayatollahs with Islam. I think they're using Islam as a tool, as a smokescreen for what they're doing, and they're essentially gangsters who are using religion in the name of their bloodshed. And so that is my really, really important message at the end of this podcast, that I'm not associating Islam explicitly with corruption and Ayatollahs. Yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Is that a common thing that people could use against you to say, oh, you actually hate Islam?
I would say so, and, you know, in a way that some people, for example, there have been people who have criticised, you know, like Israel, that would get branded as anti-Semitic, but actually I think they're two separate things, not too dissimilar from this. I think anyone who might criticise Ayatollahs could be seen as Islamophobic, and I don't think they have anything to do with each other.
Sorry, I'm just looking up have you seen the Larry David Curb Your Enthusiasm?
Oh, so I've seen that episode. It was a long time ago. But was it something to do with one of the Ayatollahs?
Yeah. What if a fatwa?
A fatwa is when an Ayatollah issues a request, a fatwa. So, for example,
oh yeah, and Larry David actually has a fatwa against him.
Brilliant.
So is that that could happen to me for releasing this podcast?
I don't think so. because I think you've been very balanced. They might issue a fatwa on me, but I think you'll be fine.
I feel like we're not. Our profile isn't big enough for that. Need more than 1,000 followers.
What do you think about this all? What do you think about? Do you think I sound like a complete Fruit Loop? Do you think that what I'm saying about the women's rights movement, would you agree that it needs more support? What's your thoughts?
Well, how would you propose that we support people? Because I guess it's confusing because you're talking about Western influence. The West, the whole thing is, it's like, okay, this is kind of how liberalism works. So it's like free speech, free religion, free trade. So it's like we want other countries to be free, to be democratic, so we can trade with them and have good relations and we don't kill each other. But also, you guys have some resources. We have, like, we make things over here, you make different things, like comparative advantage. We can trade and then we're all wealthier. But it is kind of like, if you think about interfering, I mean, especially just with like what happened with Afghanistan, like the whole thing of going into other countries, it's like that's like the American thing, you know, of like, or Vietnam or whatever. And yeah, I'm obviously not an expert on any of these things, and people could be like totally cringing at my ignorance. But again, like, feel free to come on and teach us, because we're just trying to learn. But the whole idea is to just go in. It's like, what can you do? Like, send the military, send people to die for another country that has nothing to do, you know, it's like, it's different. Like, so, Ukraine, it's like that, it's an invasion. Yeah. And then it's like all to do with, you know.
So a perfect example of that would be the nuclear deal. So the European Commission are still to this day meeting the Iranian delegation at a table and exercising diplomacy with them. And for me, because of what's happened in the last 6 months with the human rights abuses, the clear brutality, the murder of, I don't want to put a number on it because I'll get fact checked, but it's really high. It's really high. My cousins have told me so many people are being killed by the Iranian government for going out and protesting against the Islamic Republic. Why are we enabling this government? A nuclear deal would provide less sanctions for the Iranian government, and it would make the oligarchy, the establishment, even richer. Why can't we make life more difficult for them from a diplomatic perspective?
So the idea of so does that mean you're with Trump on this one? So
most Iranians and liberal Iranians were massively pro-Trump because Trump was the only person who actually stood up to the Ayatollahs. So the idea of the nuclear deal is it was like, okay, if we make this nuclear deal so we know what you're doing, that you're not making nuclear weapons, we will reduce the amount of sanctions. It's incredibly difficult because if the European Commission, if the US just turned its back on Iran and said, right, we're not going to trade with you because of what you're doing in Iran, it would enable Iran and the Iranian government to go off and do things, unspeakable things, like creating an atomic bomb. So I guess they are just exercising diplomacy. They're making compromises, and it just seems like a really impossible situation if you are just an ordinary person in Iran, because neither outcome is going to be that great for you. You've got option one for the Islamic regime to become even stronger and through trade through the West cement itself as a long-term power in Iran. And option B is for an even more isolated Iran that can't go and negotiate at the table with the West, for example. And the more isolated Iran becomes, the more likelihood there is for war, for conflict. And I'm looking from the perspective of an ordinary women's rights protester in Iran. I would be asking America, Europe for its help with the protests, because there's nowhere else to turn. If you look east,
and what
China's
does help
helping
look
them.
like?
So this is
There were
really,
massive protests in London, by the way.
Yeah.
Bloody
Yeah.
took me along. That
They
was
were
my
huge.
support. Was taking a massive detour because so many of the roads were blocked off.
Look, I'll be really honest with you. Because Iran has seen 2 revolutions, both orchestrated by Britain and the USA, that's what the protesters in Iran would idealise even today. They would fully support. It's difficult because without there being an invasion like we saw in Iraq or Afghanistan, it has to be through propaganda. It has to be through education, and the solution from the conversations that I've had with Iranians in London and in Iran is we genuinely think the most effective way, and this goes back to my original point of, if you make life difficult for the Ayatollahs, sending all the thousands of relatives back to Iran who are currently enjoying their lives in Europe and USA, they might start making some concessions. Because what will happen is their kids, their daughter-in-laws, their son-in-laws, their nephews, their nieces who have been out in London for 5, 10, 15 years making a life for themselves, have jobs here or get sent back, all of a sudden these lawmakers might actually listen. They'll say, okay, fine. What do you want for us to send it's literally tens of thousands of relatives back to Switzerland, back to London, back to America? And that would be...
Yeah, but that's pretty hard because it's like then the UK...
No, I know.
It's like we... Because we have
it goes
different
against
values.
every fucking human rights law you could think of.
But it's also like, that's the point of being in a free country, that you accept. Because otherwise you could look at every country in the world and say, oh, well, we don't like how they're doing things in that country, so we're not going to let any of their relatives... it's like, where do you draw the line?
Yeah.
Like, and that's why it's like, okay, when a war starts, then you, like with Russia, then you can look at...
But they have been doing that to Russians, and by freezing their assets. So maybe
that's
after
an invasion. So it's like, if...
You say that, but the Iranian government has killed tens of thousands of people since it came into power. That is for me, it's a civil war. I think they have committed enough heinous acts.
Think of how many other countries in the world kill their people, and the UK, it's like, what's the UK gonna do? Like, okay, we have a list of countries we think are good, and it's super hard.
No, I hear you. I don't have a clear-cut, succinct solution to this. I'm just, here's what's happening. I think awareness is incredibly important at the moment. There might be some, some billionaire somewhere who just thinks of something.
Well,
Elon Musk has been sending Starlink technology into Iran. So the internet in Iran is heavily censored. So Elon Musk has been, through insiders in Iran, they've been creating this free internet service for everyone in Iran so that they can broadcast what's going on. It's these little things. Elon Musk probably just saw a tweet or watched a video that went viral, and there's a material impact. I think if everyone in the world spoke about the women's rights protest for a day, that somehow there would just be a step in the right direction. I think awareness is everything.
So you're going to share this podcast so it has more chance?
Yeah, why not?
Well,
I do have to be very careful because Iran is a very hostile country, and there are many dual nationals who get punished for saying this stuff, and I'm not going to be exempt to that. So.
But not while you're overseas.
Not while I'm overseas, but I'm super conscious of this now, and I think it's the least I can do. You know, fine, I sacrifice being able to go back to Iran, but so what? Like, it's life's fucking hard for a lot of people living in Iran. This is the least I could do as, a service. And I hope more Iranians speak up. Honestly, there are some really prominent activists. Omid Jalili, he's a very famous British-Iranian comedian, and his social media now has just gone from stand-up comic to just basically a political activist, and loads of Iranian actors, actresses in Hollywood, they're speaking up, so good on them. Long may it continue. And if you're an Iranian listening to this, or of any other country, please do spread the word, because what's happening in Iran is it hasn't died. The revolution, well, not the revolution, the women's rights movement is ongoing. It's being clamped down very fiercely by the government. But let's not let it die.
And what's your ideal vision for Iran in 10 years from now?
Ideal vision for Iran is for the government to be completely secular, democratic, respectful of all religions, all races, exactly how it was 2,500 years ago under Cyrus the Great. He was famously tolerant. He had all Christianity, Islam, Judaism, all in Iran. He was, and Jewish people can fact check me, but Jewish people were allowed into Persia after, I think there was some very biblical event that happened, and that's the Iran that I see: multicultural, tolerant, and that's the Iran that I'd like it to get back to. I'm trying, but this is the first podcast I've ever done, so I'm so fucking rusty. I don't know if what I'm saying makes sense, but it's coming from the heart. It's coming from a good place.
Okay, this was meant to be about you and your life. We didn't really talk about that. Can you just tell the Liverpool story before we finish?
There is a part of me that doesn't want to go too much into myself, because then it just becomes like, what do you want to know about me?
The Liverpool story.
Oh, the Liverpool FC.
Yes.
This is going off on a tangent.
Just in 2 minutes, and then we can wrap up the podcast. So
I won a football competition with my five-a-side football team. We entered a video to a Nivea marketing campaign that was so funny that it won on Comedy Value, and we got to play Ian Rush, who is Liverpool's top goal scorer ever, McAteer, amazing Liverpool legend, John Barnes, England legend, Michael Thomas, Arsenal legend, won the league with Arsenal at Anfield. We played them in a five-a-side game of football, and we lost 3-1, but I'll remember that forever.
And you're a Liverpool fan?
Arsenal.
Oh, what? But you grew up in Manchester.
Yeah. So my uncle who got me into football supports Arsenal.
Confusing. And that was the highlight of your life?
No, highlight of my life wasn't a football game. Highlight of my life is probably when I go travelling. I like to see the world. Japan's got to be up there. Japan is the closest thing to being on a different planet, I would say, in a good way.
the US is the closest thing to being on a different planet for me, having lived there.
Why is that?
Oh, that's a whole nother podcast. Okay. Anything else? See, because we're meant to like talk about you first, and then get into all the stuff. But anyway, we got into all the stuff.
All the stuff.
You're from Manchester. You live in London. You work in
about me.
Yeah, but that's the point of this podcast. This podcast isn't a platform for people to just say their political views.
Okay,
the podcast is about like your name goes in the title.
Mm-hmm.
But there's 3 questions I ask you at the end. No, and also people I think are more sympathetic to your political views when you warm them up with
fine.
it's too late now. We're an hour and a half in, but with I played, against this England legend. People are like, oh, I like this guy.
Mm-hmm. I see. Character building. Yeah. Character development. Sorry. Yeah, no, I see. Yeah, none of that. None of that.
I can put a snip of it in the intro. Okay, so should I ask you the last 3 questions? What were you about to say?
You can't. Okay, cool.
Why?
No, I was just wondering. Okay, so what do you want to know about me?
No, so the last 3 questions that I ask everyone.
Okay, go on.
Why? Just say what you want to say.
Last 3 questions that you ask everyone.
Yeah.
What are they?
Okay. How do you stay grounded?
How do I stay grounded? Just treat others how you would want to be treated yourself, and don't get too big headed. Because. That's what I think.
That's like your daily practice.
How do I stay grounded daily?
Yeah. People might say like go for a walk, but yours was
just
really
be able
nice.
to laugh at yourself. Like northern sense of humor is self-deprecation, and just be down to earth and know that. Just treat others how you would like to be treated, and that's just that's the way I go about my day.
Okay, what's the book that's had the most impact on your life?
Book that's had the most impact, I would say. Maybe it's a really difficult question to just narrow it down to one book.
You can mention a couple.
So one that I read recently, no, because then it's not my whole life that I've been thinking about it.
No, I phrased it badly. Just a book that's had a big impact.
Ikigai, The Secret to a Long and Happy Life. So I really like the basic principles that Japanese people follow. So in terms of they have this view that anything in moderation, for example, community. They think that when you get old and retire, you should still be a useful member of your community, and that's what keeps people ticking ultimately. I find that really interesting. Exercise, really good stress reliever. My brother told me a few days ago, and you can fact check this later, that when you sweat, you're literally releasing oxytocins, and it literally reduces your stress. So I think great exercise, little bit of meditation. This is digressing now.
That oxytocin
is it bullshit?
No, that's just mixing up the science.
Fine.
But
Oh,
we'll get someone on to explain that.
yeah, please do.
No one's going to be offended, don't worry.
Thank you.
So, what's the last thing?
No, that was it, really. What was the last question?
Is what Fuck, sorry. So this is... No, actually... Yeah, exercise endorphins. No, sorry, I was thinking of cortisol is the stress hormone. If you exercise too
cortisol.
much. No, but you can release too much cortisol, which is the
Seriously?
stress or something.
Oh, I'll say that to my brother.
No. Oxy.
I'm literally
Which
spreading...
one's oxytocin?
I'm literally spreading misinformation now on your podcast.
No, but what do you mean? That's just humans. Like, we just say what we think and we just work stuff out by talking to each other. Are you Googling now which hormones? What's oxytocin? I think is like the...
Way off the money.
When you hug someone, it releases oxytocin.
Right. Okay.
Don't know.
Okay, so how do you stay grounded? Make sure you always treat others how you want to be treated. Favourite book? Ikigai. What was the third question?
Wait, can I just say Ikigai, the 4 principles, or the 4...
I think I read The Secret to a Long...
Yeah.
And
but so it's like what you're good at, what pays you, what the world needs, and what you love. It's like the sweet spot between those 4 things.
Yeah.
Is your Ikigai.
Yeah, and it talks about, and a really interesting point is that when you're in a flow state, it's almost like meditation when you do something that is like a hobby or a profession or a passion. The actual act of doing it puts you into this like meditative state, this flow state, and it's like when people pick up like painting, for example, or exercising, they find it really therapeutic. I think it's so important just to have a hobby, have something that gives you that release.
I'm Googling, does sweat release oxytocin, in case I'm totally wrong. Okay, last question.
Yep.
Is maybe it... I don't know. Okay, someone can teach us about that later. Last question is, what 3 words describe the best version of you?
Three words to describe the best version of me: thoughtful, kind, and funny. I think just having a good sense of humour and making people laugh is the ultimate joy. Kindness just goes back to, I really am a believer of just as long as you just treat others how you would like to be treated yourself, I think you're onto a winner. And thoughtfulness, just, you know, if you think something's up with someone, or, you know, if you know you want to be a good mate to someone, or, you know, to your family member, just be thoughtful, because you never know what someone else is going through. And yeah, I think that's important. I sound so fucking sanctimonious, don't I? I need a negative adjective here as well to bring myself down a peg.
No, it's the best version of you.
Okay, yeah, you did say the best version, right? Yeah, so I'm not a complete knob.
Okay, can you tell us a joke to finish? Because since you said you're funny.
Okay, so what's a pirate's favourite letter?
R.
Ah, you'd think that, but their real love be the C.
Classic.
So I love that one.
Okay, what were you going to say before?
I have a friend, Gavin, who died of heartburn recently. Can't believe Gavin's gone.
Classic. Pete, I feel like that's a British joke, because Gaviscon might not be available in all markets. Okay. Any final words?
Thank you very much for having me. And I hope I haven't bored you to death with my rantings on the women's rights movement, but it is something that's it's a cause that's very close to my heart, and I hope that I've spread the word